As the capital of Virginia during the colonial period, Williamsburg and its residents are a great example of life before and during the Revolution. The town was probably similar to what would be imagined. Shops lined the main street that would probably be full of horse-drawn carriages and bustling crowds. Williamsburg was a very important city where newspapers were printed, physicians helped people from surrounding areas, and politicians met to discuss current matters at the local taverns. The town was a tight-knit community, maybe because so much of the town lived on only a few streets. At only 5,000 residents, and half of them slaves, it was still small in some ways. As I just mentioned, there was a slave population. Most households held just a few, but some held more than 20. There were schools in town for both white children and slave children. Jamestown was very different from Williamsburg. Of course, it was settled long before a capital city had been thought about. It resembled other settlements in America in the early to mid-17th century. First, new residents were arriving by ship every few months or so. The first settlers were all men. The ships were a small area for that many men to be on, but they survived, some at least. They cooked and cleaned, and when they needed to sleep, slept where they could. Once they arrived, and others began to arrive, their communities began to grow. A Jamestown community and many early communities were somewhat distinctive. There were a few long, tall houses where multiple families would live. There were small areas to garden in, as well as places for blacksmiths and other craftsmen to work. In the center of the town was a church, as all of the residents were part of the Church of England. This tiny community was guarded by a tall wooden fence with peepholes on the edges along with cannons. This was to look out for Indian attacks. The natives that lived near Jamestown made up the Pamunkey tribe, which was a part of the Powhatan Confederacy. Although this tribe caused trouble with the settlers, mostly over land, they had their own community and had been living this way for quite some time. They lived in small huts called ehakans, where they stored goods, fur, and other items. Men hunted while women worked to preserve what had been brought to them. Young boys would carve out canoes, while young girls would learn from their mothers. The Pamunkeys worked hard to preserve their lifestyle, even though the settlers were coming in and changing things. The people of Yorktown lived very differently from the people of Williamsburg or Jamestown. First, it was almost 150 years after the people of Jamestown had been around. And the people of Yorktown were not city people like the people of Williamsburg. They were farmers who did not go into town that often, only when selling crops. These were the people that farmed the very important cash crop of tobacco. Yorktown became busier as the war began. It was a place soldiers ate, slept, and eventually fought at. They lived in small tents where 6 men would sleep. The only fire they had was the fire to cook on in their dugout stove, where one tent member would cook up a small pot of stew for the 6 of them. Yorktown was not the easiest of places to live because it was far from town and because the soldiers did not have the resources they needed. But it, as well as Williamsburg and Jamestown, is a historic place today.